Hi, Assalamu alaikum, and good evening to all. The purpose of this video is to introduce one of my books, Islam and Secularism, which is one of the first books I've written on the subject of Islam after I got a job at the International Science University of Malaysia back in 2002 now. That seems like a long time ago. Anyway, I stayed there until 2008, so that was altogether about 5 years. And of course, while I was hired mainly to teach English and literature and creative writing and Shakespeare's Othello from the perspective of Islam, I of course had other interests too, and one of them was this relationship between Islam and secularism. I was educated, as you may know, from some of my previous videos in Canada, and I was a major in political philosophy. I never managed a PhD, but I have done a couple of master's degrees at the University of Toronto and one bachelor's degree at the University of Guelph, where I originally majored in political science and economics. So actually, after I came to the Islamic sector, I realized that there are quite a few parallels between political theory or political philosophy, if you like, and what we know in Islam as the science of jurisprudence or fiqh. Another term that comes to mind is siyasa sharia, the political policies of the Muslim polity. But anyway, to come back to the book, basically, I should mention or could mention the impetus for writing writing the book in the first place, and basically how it started. It started even before I joined the Islamic sector, because I remember in my last year in the private sector, before I came to the Islamic University, I was a teacher in a Canadian matriculation program at one of the local colleges here, which is now a university also. And I taught a variety of subjects there. Altogether, I think I taught about a dozen different subjects in the matriculation programs, both here in Malaysia and also in Canada, where my career in this field started. And I completed about 2 years of teaching there before I came over to Malaysia. But anyway, so I noticed that a lot of the topics were quite similar and the concerns, because of course in political theory we talk a lot about the law, what are the sources of the law, and in fact law was also among the subjects that I taught, but that was of course Canadian law, and I focused mostly on criminal law. It was a very interesting experience also. But as I was saying, in my last year at the university, I was having a discussion one day with some students in one of my classes, and I think I mentioned something to the effect that Malaysia was, I quote, an Islamic state, quote unquote. So that didn't go down very well with some of my students. My students at that time in the private sector were mostly non-Muslims, so perhaps they found my reference to the quote unquote Islamic state a little bit scary, and I can't blame them given what we have seen from the so-called Islamic State back in Iraq and Syria. You probably know the story. So yeah, there were some pretty horrifying things that these fellows did, and that's not what I had in mind at all when I used the term Islamic State. I was basically reiterating what the Prime Minister at the time, Tun Dr. Mahathir, actually said himself. You might say I was just quoting him, because that's what he said at that time, that Malaysia was actually already an Islamic state, and I think he said it not long after in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers back in over there in New York. So I thought I was on safe ground when I was quoting the Prime Minister of the country, and I wasn't trying to introduce anything new, so to speak. There was no political bid'ah, so to speak, if I may borrow the phrase. But nevertheless, it still, I guess, must have frightened a few students, because some of them I found out later, went and complained about me to my boss, who was the director of our program, a fellow from Canada, and he called me into the office and said to me basically that, and this is almost verbatim, I recall the conversation we had. He said, Leslie, I heard that you are making how did he put it, inflammatory statements of a political and religious nature in your class, end of quote. And then he sort of expressed that he was sort of concerned about that. And then I asked him a question. Well, I told him, basically I responded by saying first that, well, sir, I don't recall making any such inflammatory statements. And then I asked for some evidence. Could I see some or hear some evidence? Any particular statement that I made, how was it inflammatory, and how was it political or religious? Because I don't recall making such statements. What I did say during the class, I recall this, was that I was touching on the issue of prayer and the issue of polytheism, and somehow the discussion came to the point where some of my students who were, how do I put this, should I be even saying this in this video because it is going into the public domain. uh, well, I think I should say it. Some of them were of the Hindu background, and I don't have anything against Hindus, don't get me wrong. I believe what the Quran teaches. There is no compulsion in religion. As far as I'm concerned, everyone is free to choose or leave any religion he or she wishes. There's absolutely no compulsion in religion. That this is Allah Ta'ala is leaving it as up to us. After all, we know from the Quran that Allah has bestowed dignity on the children of Adam, and to force somebody to become religious against their will is actually a violation of that dignity. So I think actually it is prohibited in Islam to force anybody either to become a member of a certain religion or to leave a particular religion. And in fact, one of my friends, Dr. Omar Ramahi, has just released a video on apostasy on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. In fact, I have just briefly communicated with him. He actually sent me a copy of the video, and I replied a few minutes later that actually I had already begun to watch the video even before I got the message from him. I managed to get through the first 30 minutes or so of the video, and I intend to finish watching it. But I would like to also recommend the video to all my viewers as well, because I think that Brother Omar is one of the leading, critics of traditional Islam, and I think we should pay attention to what he has to say. In fact, he has recently published a brilliant book, if I may say so, called the Muslim's Greatest Challenge, Choosing Between Islam and Tradition. And I like the way he puts it succinctly, because that is pretty much the crux of the matter here. What exactly is the relationship between Islam and tradition, or between the Book of Allah and the books of the traditions, to put it more, concisely. So anyway, coming back to the story, what was happening basically was that after we had this discussion, I should mention what was my boss's reply to this, to my objection. He had a very interesting reply that I would not expect from someone educated in Canada, quite frankly. I'm not going to mention his name to protect his identity, but what he said basically was that, I quote again, this is practically verbatim, "Oh, come on, Leslie, we are not into evidence here. It is the perception that counts. It is the perception that counts." End of quote. I could not believe my ears. But I was stunned. But then he told me basically that he wanted me to leave the job pretty much that same day or that week. And I said to him, well, not that I begged him, but I told him that, well, at least let me finish the term, and then he agreed to finish, to let me finish my term at the college, and then basically I was out of a job. And so this was one of the strange turns and twists, but looking back over the longer term, I realized that actually Allah Ta'ala had something better for me, and that better thing turned out to be my work later in the at the Islamic Science University because the word got around that I was kind of like available, quote unquote, and then I had a call from someone at the university, and I went to talk to this person, and we talked. Well, are you? Because I was planning to open a tuition center in the most Islamic part of Malaysia, the state called Kelantan. My wife and I even went up there to look for a suitable place to rent. So anyway, the word got around to this gentleman from the senior officer of the university, and he invited me. We had a chat, and he asked me whether I would be willing to join them. So of course, people say beggars can't be choosers. Not to say that I was a beggar, but I was kind of looking for some work. So I said, yeah, sure. So then, it went on from there. An interview was arranged, and then it took a while to go through the bureaucratic process because in Malaysia it's not that easy to as if for a foreigner, I suppose, to work for the government, because essentially what happened is that I became, without actually realizing it, I became a civil servant of Malaysia, so to speak. Now I have no complaints. I have many fine people there, and I have dear friends, within the Muslim community here and elsewhere. But it was quite a turn of events. But anyway, so this book on secularism, it started as a paper which I wrote at the university, and the paper was, in a sense, a continuation of the discussion that I had with my students, you see, in that classroom that day that I basically lost my job in a private sector. So I wanted to articulate the case for Islam as a viable political system which respects human rights and liberties, including the freedom of religion, and in fact extends protection to the minorities, you see. We do not need to understand the concept of an Islamic State the way, for instance, that terrorist group ISIS conceived of it. Their notion was completely misguided. Their notion was almost completely based on tradition or the hadith, which is very different, if I may say, from what the Quran teaches about, the political system, if you like, although the main focus of the Quran is not politics, it is faith. However, the community in Medina that the Prophet eventually established incorporated in it Quranic principles. For example, even the Jews were part of the Ummah in that community under the Charter of Medina. But if you say that today to any traditional Muslim, they will be shocked. What do you mean the Jews were part of the Ummah? That cannot be. Well, I'm sorry, check your facts. They were part of the Ummah, and there was no discrimination against non-Muslims in the Medina community that the Prophet established. They had pretty much equal rights in those days. And some of the Islamists today would probably do well to take a leaf out of the political system outlined, however briefly, in the Constitution of Medina. By the way, I have some videos on that also with Brother Omar Zaid, so if anyone is interested in following up on that, please look at those videos about the Charter of Medina. But anyway, like I said, this video is mainly dedicated to highlighting this book on Islam and secularism. And basically the conclusion that I came to in the book is that, look, you can have, if you understand what we would think of as an Islamic State correctly, there's nothing to fear. Nothing for the minorities to fear, because such a state should provide better protection even than some of the secular states have done in the past. And all I need to do is to give a couple of examples. Nazism was a secular ideology, and what happened to the minorities under this particular secular regime? Communism was another secular polity or regime, I should say. And what happened to the dissidents under this system? Under both systems were secular, and under both of these systems, millions and millions upon millions of people died, were slaughtered mercilessly. And we know from history that at the time when the Jews were persecuted in Christendom, for example, they in fact found refuge in Spain under the Muslim rule, you see. The Jews, along with the Christians, are considered to be the people of the book, and they get protection, from the Muslim community. That's assuming that we understand what the Quran, the Book of Allah, teaches about these things correctly. And that is, I think, our challenge, to ensure that our understanding of the Book of Allah is not tainted or contaminated by biases, some of which originate in the traditions, and other biases may originate in the perceptions of the ulama, who are perhaps, some of whom have presented a skewed picture to us of what an Islamic polity looks like. But basically, that's what it boils down to. Is that the book was an attempt. The book is now, the paper has since turned into a book, and the book is basically an effort to articulate the case for the viability of a political system that has roots in or legislation in revelation. And I will conclude by simply noting that actually even the secular states are not completely divorced from revelation, because, for example, the prohibitions against murder, stealing, and I think adultery, or used to be anyway, they all come from the Ten Commandments, you see. So even the so-called secular states draw on some of their laws, legal rulings from religion. And I recall when I used to teach law, religion actually is a recognized source of the law, even in Western or secular jurisprudence. So anyway, I will leave it at that. If you have any comments to share, please put them in the comment section below. And hope you enjoy the talk. And if you do get the book, I hope you will enjoy it. There's an abridged version of the book available on Academia and ResearchGate under my legal name, Leslie Jarabesi on Academia, and under my Muslim name, Abdul Karim Abdullah on ResearchGate. So happy reading, and we'll see you next time. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.